Don't eat that. The desperate scream of a homeless boy shattered the elegant silence of Park Cafe as billionaire Bernard Green raised his spoon to his lips. What this ragged child saw would expose a web of betrayal, greed, and attempted murder that reached into the highest echelons of society. A wife's deadly secret, a fortune worth killing for, and one brave soul who risked everything to save a stranger's life. Comment your city below so I can see how far this incredible true story travels around the world. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the mahogany tables of Park Cafe, Manhattan's most exclusive dining establishment, where reservations required both substantial wealth and social connections that money alone couldn't buy. The autumn rain drummed against floor-to-ceiling windows, creating a cocoon of warmth and luxury that separated the elite patrons from the harsh realities of the street below. Bernard Green, worth $3.7 billion, according to Forbes' latest count, sat at his usual corner table, table 7, always table 7, methodically cutting his perfectly prepared filet mignon. At 62, his silver hair was immaculately styled, his charcoal Armani suit pressed to perfection, and his Patek Philippe watch caught the light with each precise movement. Success radiated from every fiber of his being, earned through decades of ruthless business decisions and an almost supernatural ability to predict market trends. Across from him, his wife Marissa embodied elegance itself. 38 years old, with platinum blonde hair swept into a sophisticated chignon, she wore a cream-colored Chanel dress that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Her emerald earrings, a gift for their 5th wedding anniversary, caught the candlelight as she delicately sipped her wine, painting the picture of marital bliss that graced Society magazine's monthly. The Hartwell acquisition should finalize next week, Bernard said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to getting everything he wanted. That'll bring our pharmaceutical portfolio to 43% of the northeastern market. Marissa smiled, that practiced smile she'd perfected during their courtship. You always were brilliant with numbers, darling, though I sometimes wonder if you love your companies more than you love me. Her laugh was musical, but something flickered in her green eyes, something that didn't quite match the lightness of her tone. Business built our life together, Bernard replied, reaching across the table to touch her hand. Everything we have, everything we are started with those first investments. His wedding ring clinked against hers, 2 bands worth more than most people's homes. Outside, pressed against the rain-streaked window like a ghost from another world, 12-year-old Malik Williams watched the scene unfold. His clothes hung in tatters 3 sizes too large and salvaged from donation bins. His sneakers had holes that let in every puddle, and his thin jacket provided little protection against October's bite. But his dark eyes were sharp, intelligent, taking in details that most adults would miss. Malik had been living on these streets for 8 months, ever since his grandmother, his only family, had passed away, and the state system had failed him once again. He'd learned to survive through observation, reading people like Bernard read financial reports. And right now, every instinct screamed that something was wrong at table 7. The woman, the beautiful blonde woman in expensive clothes, was acting strangely. While her husband spoke, she'd reached into her designer purse and extracted something small. A vial. No bigger than her thumb, filled with clear liquid that caught the light differently than water would. Malik pressed closer to the window, his breath fogging the glass. The woman looked around nervously, checking to see if anyone was watching. The waiters were busy with other tables. Her husband was studying his phone, scrolling through what looked like stock reports. The other diners were lost in their own conversations about charity galas and yacht clubs. The woman's hand moved with practiced precision. She uncapped the vial and poured its contents into the man's soup bowl. The lobster bisque he'd specifically requested, the one sitting untouched while he finished his main course. The liquid disappeared into the creamy orange surface without a trace. My God, Malik whispered, his breath creating a small cloud on the window. He'd seen enough crime documentaries on the library's computers to recognize what he was witnessing. This wasn't a loving wife. This was a woman trying to murder her husband. Inside the cafe, Marissa had returned the empty vial to her purse and was now buttering a piece of artisanal bread with theatrical casualness. "Your soup's getting cold, Bernard," she said sweetly. "You know how you hate when food isn't served at the proper temperature." Bernard looked up from his phone, where he'd been reviewing the day's market closures. "You're right as always." He set the device aside and reached for his soup spoon, the sterling silver catching the light. "Sometimes I get so caught up in work that I forget to enjoy the finer things." "Like spending time with your wife?" Marissa asked, but her eyes weren't on his face. They were fixed on the spoon moving toward the soup bowl. "Exactly like that," Bernard said, stirring the bisque gently. Steam rose from the surface, carrying the rich aroma of lobster and cream. "Though I have to admit, my mind's been elsewhere lately. The Harrison Industries deal is more complicated than we initially thought." Malik's heart hammered against his ribs. The man was about to eat poisoned soup, and nobody inside that warm, safe restaurant had any idea. The boy looked desperately around the street for help. A police officer, a security guard, anyone but the rain had driven most people indoors. A few pedestrians hurried past under umbrellas, but they were focused on their own destinations, their own problems. The spoon was halfway to Bernard's lips now. In seconds, whatever poison the woman had poured would be in his system. Malik had read about different types of toxins in his library research sessions, escaping into knowledge when the streets became too harsh. Some worked fast, others slow. Some were detectable, others left no trace. But all of them had one thing in common: once consumed, the damage was often irreversible. Sir, don't eat that!" Malik shouted, pounding on the window with both fists. But the glass was thick, designed to muffle outside noise and maintain the restaurant's serene atmosphere. His voice barely penetrated the dining room's gentle hum of conversation and classical music. Bernard had paused the spoon hovering near his mouth, but only because a waiter had approached their table. "Everything satisfactory this evening, Mr. Green." "Perfect as always, Carlos," Bernard replied. "Please give my compliments to Chef Morrison. The filet was exceptional." "I'll be sure to pass that along, sir. Can I interest you in our dessert menu tonight? We have a spectacular chocolate soufflé that takes 20 minutes to prepare, but I assure you, it's worth the wait." Malik watched in horror as the conversation continued. The beautiful woman, the would-be murderer, was smiling and nodding, playing the part of the dutiful wife, while her husband's death sat cooling in a bowl between them. The spoon was still in Bernard's hand, and when this polite exchange ended, he would finish what he'd started. The boy made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't break the window, it was reinforced, and he was too small. He couldn't call the police. He had no phone and no money for a payphone if such things even existed anymore. But he could do something else, something desperate and probably stupid that might get him arrested or worse. He could go inside. The Park Cafe's front entrance was flanked by two doormen in crisp uniforms, men trained to spot trouble and keep undesirables away from their wealthy clientele. Malik had no illusions about what would happen if he tried to walk through that door looking like he did. But there was a service entrance on the side alley. A door he'd seen waiters and delivery people use when the dumpster had provided his dinner on particularly desperate nights. Malik sprinted around the building, his worn sneakers slapping against wet pavement. The service door was propped open to let kitchen staff step out for smoke breaks despite the rain. He could hear the clatter of dishes and rapid-fire Spanish from the prep cooks inside. This was his chance, maybe his only chance. He slipped inside immediately, hit by the warmth and the overwhelming aroma of expensive food. The kitchen was a maze of stainless steel surfaces and hanging pots with white-clad staff moving in carefully choreographed chaos. For a moment, nobody noticed the bedraggled boy who'd just materialized among them. "Que carajo?" one of the line cooks shouted when he spotted Malik. "Hey, tú no puedes estar aquí!" But Malik was already moving, weaving between prep stations and dodging grasping hands. He burst through the swinging doors that separated kitchen from dining room, and suddenly he was in the elegant space he'd only seen from outside crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, the soft murmur of society's elite discussing their rarefied concerns. Every head turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The gentle classical music seemed suddenly too loud in the shocked silence. A homeless boy, soaking wet and desperate, had just invaded their sanctuary. "Don't eat that!" Malik screamed, pointing directly at table 7, where Bernard Green still held his spoon of poisoned soup. "Sir, please don't eat that. She put something in it." Security was already moving 2 large men in dark suits who'd been stationed discreetly near the entrance. But Malik's words had frozen Bernard's spoon halfway to his mouth, and his eyes locked onto the boy's face with an intensity that cut through the chaos. "What did you say?" Bernard's voice was deadly quiet, but it carried across the suddenly silent dining room. Marissa laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. "Bernard, really? This is obviously some sort of scam. Security, please remove this person before he ruins everyone's evening." But Malik pressed forward, dodging the first security guard's outstretched arm. "I saw her. I was outside the window, and I saw her pour something from a little bottle into your soup. She's trying to poison you." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Bernard slowly lowered his spoon, his eyes moving from Malik's desperate face to his wife's perfectly composed features. Around them, the cafe's other patrons held their breath, uncertain whether they were witnessing an elaborate joke or something far more sinister. "That's absurd," Marissa said, but her laugh was slightly too high, slightly too forced. "Darling, surely you don't believe this. This street urchin over your own wife. He's obviously mentally disturbed." Bernard stood slowly, his 6-foot frame commanding attention, even in a room full of powerful people. "What's your name, son?" "Malik, sir. Malik Williams. And I swear on my grandmother's grave, I saw your wife put poison in your soup. I know how crazy it sounds, but you have to believe me." "This is ridiculous." Marissa snapped, her composure beginning to crack. "Bernard, we're not going to stand here and be insulted by some homeless delinquent, are we? Call the police and have him arrested for disturbing the peace." But Bernard was studying his wife's face with the same intensity he brought to analyzing potential business acquisitions. He'd built his fortune on reading people, on sensing when something didn't add up, when the numbers were being manipulated or the truth was being hidden. And right now, every instinct he'd honed over 4 decades in business was screaming at him. "Security, don't touch the boy," he said firmly. "Not yet." The guards stopped their advance, confused but obedient. The cafe's manager, a thin man in an expensive suit who'd been hovering nervously near the kitchen doors, stepped forward. "Mr. Green, I'm terribly sorry about this disruption. We'll have the situation resolved immediately, and of course your entire meal tonight is complimentary." "No," Bernard said, his gaze never leaving Malik's face. "I want to hear what he has to say." Malik's heart hammered as he realized this powerful man was actually listening to him. "I was hungry, sir. I've been living on the streets since my grandmother died, and sometimes I watch people eat through the windows. I know it's pathetic, but it helps with the hunger pangs. I was watching your table because you two looked so perfect, so happy. Like something from a movie." His voice cracked slightly, the emotion breaking through despite his attempt to stay focused. "But then I saw her take out this little bottle while you were looking at your phone. She looked around to make sure nobody was watching, and then she poured whatever was in it into your soup, the soup you haven't touched yet." "He's lying." Marissa's voice was sharp now, the musical quality gone. "Bernard, this is insane. You've known me for 7 years. You know I would never hurt you." "Do I?" Bernard asked quietly, and something in his tone made everyone in the restaurant lean forward slightly. "Malik, you said you saw her pour something into my soup. What kind of bottle?" "Small, maybe 3 inches long, skinny, like a test tube. It had a little cork stopper, and the liquid inside was clear. She was really careful about it, like she'd practiced before." Bernard's face had gone completely still, the way it did during hostile takeover negotiations when millions of dollars hung on every word. "Marissa, show me your purse." "What?" "That's ridiculous. I'm not going to submit to some kind of strip search because a vagrant made up a story." "Your purse, Marissa, now." The silence stretched taut as a wire. Every person in the restaurant seemed to be holding their breath. The rain continued its steady drumming against the windows, but inside time seemed suspended. "I don't have to prove anything to you," Marissa said, but her hand moved protectively to the Hermes bag beside her chair. "This is humiliating." "Ma'am," Malik said, his voice gaining strength, "if you didn't do anything wrong, then you won't mind showing what's in your purse. If I'm lying, call the police and have me arrested. But if I'm telling the truth—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Bernard reached for his wife's purse, and Marissa jerked it away from him. "Don't you dare!" she hissed. And suddenly, the beautiful socialite mask slipped completely, revealing something ugly underneath. "You have no right to go through my personal belongings based on the ravings of some street trash." The words hit Malik like a physical blow, but Bernard's expression had shifted into something cold and calculating. "Street trash. That's an interesting way to refer to someone who might have just saved my life." "Saved your life?" "Bernard, listen to yourself. You're talking crazy." But Bernard was already moving. With one swift motion, he grabbed the purse from his wife's hands. Marissa lunged for it, but he held it away from her, opening the clasp with steady fingers. Inside, nestled between lipstick and credit cards, was a small glass vial. Empty now, but traces of clear liquid still clung to its sides. The restaurant erupted. Gasps, whispers, the scrape of chairs as people leaned forward or moved away. Someone dropped a wine glass, the crystal shattering on marble, with a sound like breaking bones. "That's not mine!" Marissa shrieked, but her face had gone white as the tablecloths around them. "Someone planted it there. This is a setup." Bernard held the vial up to the light, his hands remarkably steady for a man who'd just discovered his wife had tried to murder him. "What is this, Marissa? What were you planning to poison me with?" "I don't know what that is. I've never seen it before in my life." "Ma'am," the restaurant manager said, his voice shaking, "I'm calling the police." "No?" Marissa spun toward him, desperation replacing her earlier arrogance. "You can't. This is all a misunderstanding. That homeless boy is lying, and somehow someone put that bottle in my purse to frame me." But her protests fell on deaf ears. The evidence was literally in Bernard's hands, and every person in that dining room had witnessed the drama unfold. The manager was already on his phone, speaking rapidly to a 911 dispatcher. Malik stood in the center of it all, still dripping rainwater onto the expensive carpet, hardly able to believe what was happening. He'd been living on scraps and sleeping in doorways for months, invisible to the wealthy people who walked past him every day. And now he was standing in their most exclusive restaurant, having potentially saved one of the richest men in America from being murdered by his own wife. "Son," Bernard said, his voice cutting through the chaos around them, "I need you to tell me exactly what you saw, every detail you can remember." Malik nodded, trying to organize his thoughts despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "I was watching from outside by the window. You were eating your steak and looking at your phone. Your wife was pretending to eat, but she kept glancing around nervously. Then she reached into her purse, that purse right there, and pulled out the bottle. What did she do next?" "She checked to make sure nobody was watching. The waiters were busy. You were focused on your phone and the other customers weren't paying attention. Then she uncapped the bottle and poured everything in it into your soup bowl. The liquid just disappeared into the bisque." "You're certain it was the soup? Not my water glass or wine?" "Positive." "She was very careful about it, like she'd planned exactly how to do it. After she poured it in, she put the empty bottle back in her purse and started acting normal again. That's when she told you your soup was getting cold." Bernard's jaw tightened as he processed this information. Around them, the other diners were murmuring among themselves, some pulling out phones to record what was undoubtedly going to be front-page news by morning. Others were demanding their checks, wanting to escape before the police arrived and turned the cafe into a crime scene. "This is insane," Marissa said, but her voice had lost its commanding edge. She sounded smaller now, cornered. "Bernard, you know me. You know I love you. Why would I want to hurt you?" "I don't know," Bernard replied, his tone devoid of warmth. "Why don't you tell me?" Because I didn't do anything. This whole thing is some kind of elaborate scheme to embarrass me to make me look bad. Maybe it's one of your business rivals trying to destabilize you emotionally before the Harrison deal closes. By hiring a 12-year-old homeless boy to make false accusations. Bernard's voice dripped with skepticism. Marissa, if you're innocent, then explain the vial in your purse. I can't. Someone must have planted it there. When we've been sitting at this table for over an hour, you've had your purse with you the entire time. When would someone have had the opportunity to plant evidence? Marissa's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her perfectly applied makeup starting to smudge as perspiration beaded on her forehead. For the first time since Malik had burst into the dining room, she seemed to realize how dire her situation had become. The sound of sirens cut through the restaurant's atmosphere, growing louder as police cars approached. Bernard carefully placed the vial on the table, positioning it where the responding officers would be able to see it clearly. Malik, he said, turning to the boy who had started this whole revelation. I want you to know that regardless of what happens next, you showed incredible courage tonight. Most adults would have looked the other way. I couldn't just watch someone get murdered, Malik replied simply. Even if nobody would believe me, I had to try. Well, I believe you, and apparently so does the evidence. The restaurant's front doors burst open, admitting a team of uniformed police officers led by a detective in a rumpled coat. The manager hurried over to meet them, gesturing frantically toward table 7, where the drama was still unfolding. I'm Detective Rodriguez, the lead officer announced, his voice carrying easily across the dining room. We received a report of a possible poisoning attempt. Who called this in? I did. The manager said, his hands shaking slightly. We have a situation here involving Mr. Bernard Green and his wife. Detective Rodriguez's eyes swept the scene, taking in the elegant restaurant, the well-dressed patrons, and the bedraggled boy standing near the corner table. His gaze lingered on Malik for a moment before moving to Bernard and Marissa. Mr. Green, I'm going to need you to step back from your wife, please. Ma'am, I need you to keep your hands where I can see them. This is ridiculous, Marissa protested, but she complied with the detective's instructions. I'm being falsely accused by a homeless child. This is America. Don't I have rights? Everyone has rights, ma'am, including the right to remain silent. Detective Rodriguez approached the table carefully, his eyes noting the vial sitting next to the soup bowl. Can someone explain what happened here? Bernard gestured toward Malik. This young man witnessed my wife putting an unknown substance into my food. When he tried to warn me, we discovered this vial in her purse. He pointed to the evidence sitting on the white tablecloth. Sir, Malik said, stepping forward despite his nervousness. I saw everything from outside the window. She poisoned his soup while he was distracted. Detective Rodriguez studied the boy's face, reading the sincerity there. In 20 years of police work, he'd developed a sixth sense about witnesses, and this kid was telling the truth. Ma'am, is this your purse? He asked Marissa. Yes, but that bottle isn't mine. Someone planted it there. When? How? I don't know. But I would never hurt my husband. I love him. The detective pulled on latex gloves and carefully picked up the vial, holding it up to the light. Even empty, it told a story. The size suggested it had contained enough liquid to be lethal if the contents were sufficiently concentrated. We're going to need to test both this vial and the soup for toxins, he said. In the meantime, Mrs. Green, I'm placing you under arrest on suspicion of attempted murder. The words hit the restaurant like a bomb. Several patrons gasped audibly. Others began whispering urgently into their phones. This was the kind of scandal that would dominate headlines for weeks. A billionaire nearly murdered by his beautiful wife in Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant. You can't arrest me, Marissa shrieked as the detective moved to handcuff her. I'm innocent. This is all a setup, Bernard. Tell them. Tell them I would never hurt you. But Bernard said nothing. He stood frozen, watching his wife of 5 years being read her Miranda rights, the woman he'd shared his bed and his fortune with, being led away in handcuffs. The betrayal was written across his face like a roadmap of pain. "Sir," Detective Rodriguez said, turning to Malik, "I'm going to need you to come down to the station to give a formal statement. You're not in trouble. You're a witness, possibly the most important witness we have." Malik nodded, though his stomach clenched at the thought of going to a police station. In his experience, law enforcement and homeless kids didn't mix well. But he'd started this by speaking up, and he'd see it through to the end. "I'll drive him," Bernard said suddenly. "If that's acceptable to you, Detective. The boy saved my life tonight. The least I can do is make sure he gets home safely afterward." "That's irregular, but—" Detective Rodriguez looked at Malik, who nodded his consent. "All right, but I want both of you at the precinct within the hour." As the police led Marissa away, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor, she turned back one last time. Her beautiful face was twisted with fury and desperation, all pretense of innocence finally abandoned. "You'll regret this, Bernard," she screamed. "All of you will regret this. You have no idea what you've done." The restaurant doors closed behind her with a soft whoosh, leaving an electric silence in her wake. Bernard stood alone at table 7, surrounded by the ruins of what he'd thought was his perfect life, while a 12-year-old boy who owned nothing but the tattered clothes on his back had just given him the most valuable gift imaginable, his life. The other diners began to disperse, some stopping to shake Bernard's hand, or express their shock at what they'd witnessed. But Bernard's attention was focused entirely on Malik, this unlikely hero who'd risked everything to save a stranger. "Come on, son," Bernard said, placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Let's go give the police your statement, and then we need to talk about your future." As they walked toward the restaurant's entrance, passing beneath the crystal chandelier that had witnessed so much drama, Malik couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. He'd saved a billionaire's life, but he was still homeless, still alone in the world, still just a kid trying to survive on the streets of Manhattan. He had no way of knowing that his life was about to change as dramatically as Bernard's had. That sometimes, when you do the right thing against impossible odds, the universe finds a way to reward your courage. That this night, this terrible, wonderful, life-altering night, was just the beginning of both their stories. The rain had stopped by the time they reached the street, and the first stars were beginning to appear through breaks in the clouds. Behind them, the park cafe stood empty, except for staff cleaning up the remnants of a meal that had nearly been a murder and a confrontation that had changed everything for everyone involved. Tomorrow, the newspapers would tell the story of the homeless boy who saved a billionaire. But tonight, as Bernard and Malik walked through the wet streets toward the police station, they were just two people whose lives had become unexpectedly, irrevocably intertwined by a moment of courage and a glimpse of truth through a restaurant window. The first twist in their shared story was complete, but neither of them could imagine the revelations still to come. The fluorescent lights of the Midtown North Precinct cast harsh shadows across Detective Rodriguez's cluttered desk as he reviewed Malik's statement for the third time. The boy sat rigidly in an uncomfortable plastic chair, his wet clothes beginning to dry, but still clinging uncomfortably to his thin frame. Bernard occupied the chair beside him, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the institutional beige walls and worn linoleum flooring. "So, you're absolutely certain about the timing?" Rodriguez asked, his pen hovering over the paperwork. Mrs. Green added the substance to the soup after her husband had finished his main course, but before he began eating the bisque. "Yes, sir," Malik replied, his voice steady, despite his exhaustion. She waited until he was distracted by his phone. She'd been watching him all evening, like she was waiting for the right moment. Rodriguez nodded, making another note. Across the bullpen, phones rang constantly as news of the arrest spread through the city's media networks. The story was already trending on social media. Billionaire's wife, arrested for attempted murder, saved by homeless boy. The precinct's public information officer had fielded 17 calls from reporters in the past hour alone. "Mr. Green," Rodriguez continued, turning his attention to Bernard. "Had your wife exhibited any unusual behavior recently? Changes in routine mood? anything that might suggest premeditation. Bernard was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against his knee in a rhythm that betrayed his inner turmoil. "She'd been asking about my will," he said finally. "About 6 weeks ago, she suggested we update our estate planning. Said she was worried about what would happen to her if something happened to me. That's not necessarily unusual for married couples," Rodriguez observed, though he made a note. "No, but the way she asked." Bernard shook his head. "She was very specific about the timeline for probate, about how long it would take for assets to transfer. At the time, I thought she was just being practical, but now—" The detective's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at the screen, and his expression shifted. "Lab results are in on the vial. The residue tested positive for ricin." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Malik might not have understood the full implications, but Bernard's face went ashen. Ricin was a biological weapon undetectable in food and virtually untraceable after consumption. A dose the size of what that vial could have contained would have killed him within hours, and the symptoms would have mimicked a heart attack or stroke. "Jesus Christ," Bernard whispered. "She really was trying to kill me." Before Rodriguez could respond, a commotion erupted from the interrogation rooms down the hallway. Raised voices, the sound of something metallic hitting the floor, and then Marissa's voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "I want to make a deal. Do you hear me? I have information that's worth more than your careers." Rodriguez was on his feet, immediately motioning for Bernard and Malik to stay put. "Don't go anywhere. This isn't over." He hurried toward the source of the disturbance, leaving them alone in the suddenly quiet bullpen. "Sir," Malik said softly, "are you okay?" Bernard looked at the boy who had saved his life, this child, who had nothing but still risked everything to help a stranger. "I should be asking you that question. You're the one who's been living on the streets while I've been playing house with a woman who wanted me dead." "Why would she want to hurt you? I mean, you seem like a good person." "Money, Malik. It always comes down to money." Bernard's voice carried a weariness that had nothing to do with the late hour. "When you have as much as I do, everyone around you starts calculating what they might inherit, what they might gain from your absence." Down the hallway, they could hear Marissa's voice again, more controlled now, but still urgent. The interrogation room door opened, and Rodriguez emerged with another detective, both men looking grim. They huddled in conversation for several minutes before Rodriguez returned to his desk. "What did she say?" Bernard asked immediately. "She's claiming this was part of a larger conspiracy. Says she wasn't working alone." Rodriguez settled back into his chair, his expression troubled. "She wants to cut a deal in exchange for information about other people involved." "Other people?" Bernard's voice was sharp. "What other people?" "She won't say without immunity guarantees, but she's insisting that someone else was pulling the strings, that she was being coerced." Malik felt a chill that had nothing to do with his damp clothes. "You mean there might be more people trying to hurt Mr. Green?" Before anyone could answer, Rodriguez's phone rang. He answered with a curt, "Rodriguez," then listened intently, his expression growing increasingly serious. When he hung up, he was already reaching for his jacket. "We have a problem," he announced. "There's been a break-in at your apartment, Mr. Green. Happened about 30 minutes ago. Neighbors reported hearing glass breaking and seeing multiple figures with flashlights." Bernard shot to his feet. "My apartment. But how would anyone know?" He stopped mid-sentence, understanding flooding his features. "If Marissa was working with someone else, they'd know I wouldn't be home tonight. They'd have hours to search for whatever they were looking for." "We need to get over there immediately," Rodriguez said. "Both of you are coming with me. If Mrs. Green is telling the truth about a conspiracy, you might not be safe anywhere right now." The ride to Bernard's Upper East Side penthouse was tense and silent. Malik pressed his face to the police cruiser's window, watching the city's wealthy neighborhoods roll past. These streets were as foreign to him as another planet, tree-lined avenues with doormen and security cameras where his presence would normally trigger immediate suspicion. The building was a pre-war masterpiece, 30 stories of limestone and glass that probably cost more than entire city blocks in other boroughs. Police cars were already on scene, their flashing lights painting red and blue patterns on the elegant facade. Crime scene technicians moved in and out of the building's marble lobby like ants in an expensive anthill. 19th floor, Rodriguez announced as they entered the elevator with two other officers. Penthouse level. Security cameras show 3 individuals gained access through a service elevator around 11:15 p.m. 3 people, Bernard muttered. This wasn't some random burglary. The elevator opened directly into Bernard's apartment, revealing a space that took Malik's breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Central Park and the Manhattan skyline. The furnishings were museum-quality, each piece carefully selected and positioned, or rather they had been carefully positioned before the break-in. Now the apartment looked like a war zone. Furniture was overturned, paintings had been removed from walls, and the contents of every drawer and cabinet were scattered across polished hardwood floors. The intruders had been thorough and systematic, searching for something specific. They knew what they were looking for. The lead crime scene technician reported to Rodriguez. This wasn't about stealing valuables. They ignored jewelry, electronics, artwork, anything that would normally attract burglars. They focused on papers, files, anything that might contain information. Bernard moved through his destroyed home with growing alarm. "My study," he said suddenly, hurrying toward a room at the far end of the apartment. If they were looking for business documents, the study was the most thoroughly ransacked room they'd encountered. A massive mahogany desk had been completely emptied, its contents forming mountains of paper across an expensive Persian rug. Filing cabinets stood open like gaping mouths, their contents similarly strewn about. "The safe," Bernard said, moving to a landscape painting that hung askew on the wall behind his desk. He swung it aside to reveal a large digital safe, its door standing wide open. "They got into my safe." "What was in there?" Rodriguez asked. "Important documents, wills, insurance policies, business contracts." Bernard's face went pale. "And something else. Something I haven't looked at in years but never threw away." "What kind of something?" "Evidence. Documentation of irregularities in my pharmaceutical acquisitions from 3 years ago. I suspected someone on my board was embezzling, but I could never prove it. The investigation went nowhere, so I locked everything away and forgot about it." Malik watched the adults exchange meaningful glances, sensing undercurrents he didn't fully understand. "Sir, what if Mrs. Green wasn't trying to rob you? What if she was trying to stop you from remembering something?" Bernard stared at the boy, struck by the insight. "Or stop me from investigating something? Malik, what if the reason she tried to poison me wasn't about inheritance money at all?" Rodriguez pulled out his notebook, flipping to a fresh page. "Mr. Green, I need you to tell me everything about these pharmaceutical acquisitions. Every detail you can remember." "It started with Harrison Industries." Bernard began settling into one of the few chairs that hadn't been overturned. 3 years ago, we acquired their generic drug manufacturing operation. The deal went through smoothly, but afterward, I noticed discrepancies in the financial records. Money that should have been accounted for just disappeared. "How much money?" "Initially, I thought it was about 12 million. But as I dug deeper, the number kept growing. By the time I stopped investigating, we were looking at potentially $40 or $50 million in missing funds." "Who else knew about your investigation?" "My CFO, my head of legal affairs, and—" Bernard's face darkened. "My wife. Marissa knew everything. I discussed it with her because I was considering involving federal investigators." Rodriguez wrote rapidly, pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to form in his mind. "What made you stop the investigation?" "Pressure from my board of directors. They argued that pursuing it would damage the company's reputation, affect stock prices, hurt innocent employees." And then evidence started disappearing. Key documents went missing from our secure files. Witnesses suddenly developed memory problems. It became clear that someone with significant influence was working against me. "Someone on your board?" "I suspected so, but I could never identify who. The embezzlement was sophisticated, carried out by someone with intimate knowledge of our systems and procedures. A uniformed officer appeared in the study doorway. "Detective Rodriguez, you need to see this." They followed him to the apartment's master bedroom, where crime scene technicians had discovered something hidden behind a loose baseboard. It was a small electronic device, no bigger than a thumb drive with tiny wires and a blinking LED light. "Surveillance equipment," Rodriguez confirmed after examining it. "Looks like it's been here for months, maybe longer. Someone's been monitoring everything that happens in this apartment." "Everything." Bernard's voice was barely a whisper. "Conversations, phone calls, computer usage if it's wireless enabled. Whoever planted this has been watching your every move." Malik felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "That means they knew you were going to dinner tonight. They knew you'd be at the restaurant. And they knew I wouldn't be home," Bernard added. "This whole thing was coordinated. The poisoning, the break-in, all of it." Rodriguez's phone buzzed again. He answered immediately, listened intently. Then his expression shifted to one of urgent concern. "We'll be right there," he said, ending the call. "What now?" Bernard asked. "Mrs. Green wants to talk. She says she's ready to tell us everything, but she'll only speak to you. Claims she's in danger and that talking to us might be the only way to keep herself alive." The interrogation room felt even smaller with 4 people crowded into it. Marissa sat handcuffed to a metal table, her designer dress wrinkled and her makeup smeared. The transformation from elegant socialite to desperate criminal was complete, and she looked every bit as trapped as she actually was. "Bernard," she said as soon as he entered, her voice cracking with emotion. "Thank God you're all right. I was so worried they might have sent someone after you." "They?" Bernard's voice was cold as winter. "Who is they?" "Marissa. The people who forced me to do this. The people who threatened to kill both of us if I didn't cooperate." Tears began flowing down her cheeks, but Bernard remained unmoved. "You tried to murder me with ricin. That's not cooperation, that's attempted homicide. You don't understand. They said if I didn't do exactly what they told me, they'd kill you anyway and make it look like an accident. At least this way, if you'd just gotten sick instead of dying, maybe we could have figured out what was happening." Rodriguez leaned forward. "Mrs. Green, if you want us to believe you were coerced, you need to start naming names. Who threatened you?" Marissa glanced around the room nervously, as if expecting to see surveillance equipment in the corners. "Victor Castellanos. He's on Bernard's board of directors and he's been embezzling money from Green Pharmaceuticals for 3 years. Bernard's intake of breath was audible. Victor Castellanos had been his mentor, the man who'd taught him how to navigate corporate politics and build a pharmaceutical empire. The betrayal cut deeper than Marissa's attempted murder. "Victor convinced you to poison me. He said Bernard was getting too close to the truth about the missing money, that if the federal investigation resumed, it would destroy the company and hundreds of people would lose their jobs. He made it sound like we were protecting everyone by killing me. He said it would look natural, a heart attack brought on by stress. The ricin was supposed to mimic cardiac arrest symptoms." Marissa's voice was barely above a whisper now. "He promised that if I did this one thing, it would all be over. The company would be safe, the employees would keep their jobs, and I'd inherit enough money to disappear and start over somewhere else." Malik spoke up for the first time since entering the room. "But you were scared when you did it. I could see it from outside the window. You kept looking around like you thought someone was watching." "Because someone was watching. Victor had people monitoring the restaurant making sure I went through with it. If I'd backed out." She shuddered. Rodriguez made another note. "Mrs. Green, we found surveillance equipment in your apartment. How long has that been there?" "Months. Victor said it was for security to make sure Bernard didn't suspect anything. But I think he was really watching me, making sure I stayed loyal." "What about tonight's break-in? Did you know about that?" "I suspected something like that might happen. Victor said they needed to recover certain documents before Bernard started investigating again. Documents that could implicate other people. Other people. Bernard's voice was sharp. How many people are involved in this? I don't know exactly. Victor mentioned having partners, people with influence in government and law enforcement. He said the embezzlement operation was bigger than just your company. Rodriguez and the other detective exchanged glances. If Marissa was telling the truth, they were looking at a conspiracy that reached far beyond a simple case of corporate theft. This could involve multiple companies, potentially hundreds of millions of dollars, and corruption at levels that would make headlines for months. Mrs. Green, Rodriguez said carefully, are you willing to wear a wire? Help us gather evidence against Castellanos and his associates. You want me to spy on Victor? Are you insane? These people tried to force me to murder my own husband. And now they might try to silence you permanently, Bernard said quietly. Marissa, if what you're telling us is true, you're the only witness who can connect Castellanos to the embezzlement and the murder plot. That makes you extremely dangerous to him. Which is exactly why I should run as far away from here as possible. Where would you go? You said yourself that Victor has people in government and law enforcement. How do you know his reach doesn't extend wherever you might try to hide? The question hung in the air like smoke. Marissa's face crumpled as she realized the truth. There was nowhere to run from people with that kind of power and influence. Her only hope was to help the authorities build a case strong enough to bring down the entire conspiracy. If I do this, she said finally, if I help you get evidence against Victor, what happens to me? That depends on what the evidence reveals and how cooperative you are, Rodriguez replied. But I can tell you that attempted murder with a biological weapon carries a sentence of 25 to life. Cooperation could significantly reduce that. And if I don't cooperate, then Victor Castellanos walks free, the embezzlement continues, and you spend the rest of your life in federal prison while he enjoys the money he stole. Malik watched the adults negotiate, fascinated by the complex web of loyalties and betrayals that had led to this moment. Less than 4 hours ago, he'd been a hungry street kid watching rich people eat dinner. Now he was sitting in a police station listening to plans that could bring down a criminal conspiracy worth millions of dollars. There's something else, Marissa said suddenly. Something Victor doesn't know I know. What's that? He's planning to leave the country. Tomorrow night there's a private jet scheduled to depart from Teterboro Airport. Destination is a non-extradition country in South America. If you don't move fast, he'll be gone forever. Rodriguez was already reaching for his phone. I need to make some calls. This is bigger than local jurisdiction. Now we're talking federal crimes, international flight conspiracy charges that could reach RICO levels. As the detective stepped out to coordinate with federal agencies, Bernard turned to Malik with an expression of profound gratitude mixed with concern. Son, I need you to understand something. What you did tonight, what you've witnessed here, it's put you in danger. People like Victor Castellanos don't leave loose ends, and you're the primary witness to his murder plot. What does that mean? It means that until we catch him and his associates, you can't go back to living on the streets. It's not safe. Malik felt a familiar panic rising in his chest. Every time adults started talking about his safety and his future, he ended up in foster homes or group facilities where he was just another problem to be managed. I can take care of myself. I've been doing it for months. Not against people like this. These aren't street criminals or petty thieves. These are sophisticated operators with resources and connections. They could find you anywhere in the city. So what are you suggesting? Bernard was quiet for a long moment, weighing decisions that would affect both their lives. I'm suggesting that you come home with me, at least until this is over. Home. You mean to that apartment that just got broken into? No, I have other properties, safe places where Victor's people wouldn't think to look, and I have security personnel who can protect both of us while the authorities build their case. Malik stared at this billionaire, who was offering to take him in, this man whose life he'd saved on impulse and instinct. Why would you do that for me? Because you saved my life tonight, and because... Bernard hesitated, then continued with quiet honesty. Because I've spent 40 years building wealth and accumulating possessions, but I've never done anything as important as what you did in that restaurant. Maybe it's time I learned something about real courage from someone who actually has it." Rodriguez returned to the room, his expression grim. "Federal agents are en route. This case is being elevated to the FBI's white-collar crime division, and they're coordinating with international law enforcement to prevent Castellanos from fleeing the country." "How long do we have?" Bernard asked. "His flight isn't until tomorrow night, but if he suspects we're on to him, he might move up his timeline. We need to move fast on the wire operation." Marissa nodded reluctantly. "I'll do it. I'll help you get him." "Good. But first we need to get you both somewhere safe. Mr. Green, I strongly recommend you don't return to any of your known residences until we have Castellanos in custody." "Already planned. I have a safe house in Connecticut that's not connected to any of my business holdings. We'll go there tonight." Rodriguez looked confused. "Malik and I. He's under my protection now." The detective studied the unlikely pair, the billionaire pharmaceutical executive and the homeless boy who'd saved his life. In 20 years of police work, he'd seen stranger partnerships, but none that had formed under circumstances quite like these. "All right," he said finally, "but I want both of you to check in every 6 hours. And if you see anything suspicious, anything at all, you call me immediately." As they prepared to leave the precinct, Malik couldn't help but wonder what he was getting himself into. Less than 12 hours ago, his biggest concern had been finding enough food to make it through another day. Now he was part of a federal investigation under protection from corporate criminals, and going home with one of the richest men in America. The irony wasn't lost on him that in trying to save someone else's life, he might have finally found a way to save his own. But as they walked toward the exit, none of them noticed the figure watching from a car across the street, or the phone call being made to report their departure. Victor Castellanos might be planning to flee the country, but he wasn't gone yet, and he had no intention of leaving behind witnesses who could destroy everything he'd worked to build. The game was just beginning, and the stakes were about to get much higher. The black sedan's headlights cut through the darkness as they wound along the Connecticut countryside, leaving the glittering sprawl of Manhattan far behind. Malik pressed his face to the window, watching unfamiliar landscapes roll past dense forests and rolling hills that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. The silence inside the car was heavy with unspoken tension, broken only by the soft hum of the engine and the occasional buzz of Bernard's encrypted phone. "Sir," Malik said quietly, his voice barely audible over the road noise. "What if they followed us?" Bernard glanced in the rearview mirror for the dozenth time in the past hour. "My driver took 3 different routes out of the city, and we switched cars twice. If anyone's following us now, they're better than I thought." The safe house materialized from the darkness like something from a dream. A sprawling colonial mansion set back from the road behind iron gates and mature oak trees. Security lights activated as their car approached, illuminating a property that managed to be both elegant and fortress-like. Bernard punched a code into the gate's keypad, and they rolled up a circular driveway toward the house. "This is your safe house?" Malik asked, his voice filled with disbelief. The building was larger than some hotels he'd seen, with multiple wings and enough windows to light up like a small city. "It belonged to my grandfather," Bernard explained as they parked near the front entrance. "I've modified it over the years for security purposes. The property is registered under a shell corporation that even my closest business associates don't know about." They were met at the front door by a tall, stern-faced woman in her 50s, wearing tactical gear that suggested military or law enforcement background. Her handshake was firm enough to crack knuckles, and her eyes swept the surrounding darkness with professional alertness. "Mr. Green," she said briskly, "I'm Sarah Chen, head of your security detail for this operation. My team has swept the property and established a perimeter. We're as secure as we can make you." "Thank you, Sarah. This is Malik Williams, the young man I told you about. He's under my protection." Sarah's expression softened slightly as she looked at the boy. "Welcome, Malik. We've prepared a room for you on the 2nd floor. Are you hungry?" The question hit Malik like a physical blow. In all the chaos of the evening, he'd forgotten that he hadn't eaten since scavenging half a sandwich from a coffee shop dumpster that morning. His stomach responded with an audible rumble that echoed embarrassingly in the grand foyer. "I'll take that as a yes," Sarah said with the first smile she'd shown. "Kitchen's this way." The house's interior was even more impressive than its facade, soaring ceilings, antique furnishings, and artwork that belonged in museums. But Malik barely noticed the opulence. His attention was focused entirely on the kitchen, where Sarah began assembling what looked like enough food to feed a small army. "Roast beef sandwich," she asked, already slicing thick pieces from a joint that had probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. "There's also leftover lasagna, or I could make you something hot if you prefer." "Anything," Malik said, his voice cracking slightly. "Whatever you have is fine." As Sarah worked, Bernard's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen, and his expression hardened. "Detective Rodriguez, I need to take this." "Bernard?" Rodriguez's voice was tense even through the phone's speaker. "We have a problem. Marissa's been attacked." The sandwich Sarah had been preparing clattered to the counter as Bernard's grip tightened on the phone. "What do you mean, attacked?" "Someone got to her in her holding cell about an hour ago. Another inmate supposedly, but the security footage mysteriously malfunctioned during the incident. She's alive, but barely. Currently in intensive care at Mount Sinai." "Jesus Christ. How is that possible? She was in police custody." "That's what we're trying to figure out. But Bernard, this confirms what she told us about Castellanos having people in law enforcement. Someone with access helped orchestrate this." Malik felt his blood turn to ice water. If they could get to Marissa in a police station surrounded by officers and security cameras, then nowhere was truly safe. He caught Sarah's eye and saw his own fear reflected in her professional composure. "What's her condition?" Bernard asked. "Critical but stable. The doctors say she was poisoned, ironically enough, with a paralytic agent that could have been mistaken for a stroke if the medical team hadn't been specifically looking for toxins." "Can she talk?" "Not yet. But if she recovers, and if she's still willing to cooperate, we might be able to move forward with the wire operation, assuming we can find a way to keep her alive long enough to use it." Bernard began pacing across the kitchen's marble floor, his mind racing through implications and contingencies. "Rodriguez, what about Castellanos? Please tell me you have him under surveillance." "That's the other problem. Victor Castellanos disappeared about 3 hours ago. His penthouse apartment is empty. His office says he left early for a family emergency, and his personal security team claims they haven't seen him since this afternoon." "He's running," Bernard said flatly. "The attack on Marissa was meant to silence her permanently, and when it failed, he decided to cut his losses and flee." "Probably. But here's the thing, his flight to South America isn't scheduled until tomorrow night. If he's running now, he's either got an alternative escape plan or what? Or he's not running at all. Maybe he's staying to finish what Marissa started." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Malik's appetite vanished completely, replaced by a churning anxiety that made him feel sick. Sarah had stopped pretending to work and was now standing at attention, her hand resting on what was obviously a concealed weapon. "Rodriguez," Bernard said, his voice deadly calm. "I need you to be straight with me. How much danger are we in?" "Honestly, I don't know. But if Castellanos is willing to attempt murder in a police station, there's probably nothing he won't do to protect his operation. You saved his target tonight, and the boy can identify multiple aspects of the conspiracy. From his perspective, you're both existential threats that need to be eliminated. What do you recommend?" "Stay exactly where you are. Don't trust anyone who isn't part of your current security team. And pray that we can find Castellanos before he finds you." The call ended, leaving them in a silence that felt somehow more oppressive than the conversation had been. Sarah immediately began making her own phone calls, coordinating with her security team, and updating their threat assessment. Bernard sat heavily in one of the kitchen chairs, looking older than his 62 years. "Sir, Malik said quietly. Maybe I should leave. If I'm putting you in danger. Absolutely not. Bernard's response was immediate and firm. Malik, what happened tonight started long before you got involved. You didn't create this situation, you exposed it. And now that you have, we're in it together. But if they want to hurt you because of me, they want to hurt me because I got too close to discovering their embezzlement operation. You saved my life tonight, and now it's my turn to protect yours. Sarah finished her phone calls and returned to their conversation. Mr. Green, my team is implementing Protocol 7. Full lockdown, rotating patrols, and electronic surveillance of the entire property. If anyone approaches within a mile of this house, we'll know about it. Good. How many people do you have? 12 on site with reinforcements available if needed. We're also coordinating with local law enforcement, though. Given what Detective Rodriguez told us about potential corruption, we're being very selective about who we trust. As if summoned by their conversation, the house's security system chimed with an incoming alert. Sarah's radio crackled to life immediately. Control to team leader. We have movement on the north perimeter, single vehicle approaching slowly with headlights off. Sarah's hand moved to her weapon again. Copy that. What's the distance? Half-mile in closing. Vehicle appears to be conducting reconnaissance rather than making a direct approach. Could be Castellanos, Bernard said grimly. Or it could be local law enforcement responding to our presence, Sarah replied. Either way, we need to be prepared for anything. The next few minutes felt like hours as they waited for updates from the security team. Malik found himself thinking about the strange turns his life had taken. How a simple act of trying to warn a stranger had led him to this moment, sitting in a billionaire's safe house, while armed guards watched for assassins in the darkness. Contact has stopped approximately 200 yards from the main gate, the radio reported. 2 occupants visible. They appear to be observing the property. Can you get a visual identification? Negative. Too dark, and they're using countermeasures to avoid our cameras. Sarah made a decision. All teams maintain current positions, but prepare for potential breach. I want eyes on every possible entry point. The radio chattered with confirmations from various positions around the property. Sarah turned to Bernard and Malik with a grim expression. We need to move you both to the secure room. Now. The secure room turned out to be a hidden chamber behind Bernard's grandfather's library, accessible through a bookshelf that swung open like something from a movie. The space was larger than Malik had expected, equipped with its own ventilation system, communications equipment, and enough supplies to last several days. This was built during the Cold War, Bernard explained as they settled into reinforced chairs. My grandfather was convinced that nuclear war was inevitable and wanted a place where the family could ride out the aftermath. Let's hope we don't need it for that long, Sarah said, monitoring her radio for updates from the perimeter teams. They didn't have to wait long. The radio crackled with urgent communication just as they were beginning to settle in for what might be a long night. Control to team leader. The vehicle just accelerated toward the main gate. They're not stopping. The sound of screeching tires and breaking glass could be heard even through the secure room's thick walls. Sarah's radio exploded with overlapping reports from multiple team members. Gate breach, gate breach. 2 occupants exiting the vehicle. Shots fired on the north lawn. Movement detected at the rear of the house. Possible secondary team. Sarah was on her feet, immediately coordinating the response while keeping one eye on her charges. All teams remember we have civilians on site. Use minimum necessary force and maintain containment. Sarah, Bernard said urgently. How many people are we dealing with? Unknown. The initial vehicle had 2 occupants, but if they're detecting movement at multiple points, we might be looking at a coordinated assault by a larger team. Malik's heart hammered against his ribs as the reality of their situation sank in. These weren't random criminals or opportunistic thieves. These were professionals conducting a military-style operation against a fortified position. The fact that they were willing to attempt something this audacious suggested a level of desperation that made them extremely dangerous. Team 3 to control, the radio reported. We have visual on the rear intruders. 4 individuals in tactical gear moving toward the house in formation. 4 plus 2 makes 6, Sarah muttered. Mr. Green, whoever these people are, they came prepared for a fight. The sound of gunfire was getting closer, and occasionally they could hear shouts and running footsteps from somewhere above them. The secure room's reinforced construction muffled most of the noise, but enough filtered through to paint a picture of a fierce battle being fought throughout the house and grounds. Control to all teams, Sarah's radio commanded. Intruders have breached the main house. Teams 4 and 5 establish defensive positions on the second floor. Teams 1 and 2 continue perimeter containment. Sarah. Bernard said, his voice tight with concern. Are your people going to be able to handle this? My team is made up of former military and law enforcement personnel, Mr. Green. They've dealt with worse situations than this. But I won't lie to you. 6 attackers in tactical gear suggests this is a professional operation, not some improvised attempt. A new voice crackled over the radio, unfamiliar and urgent. This is Team 5. We've got a problem up here. These guys aren't just trying to break in, they're setting charges. Charges! Sarah's face went pale. What kind of charges? Looks like incendiary devices. They're not trying to capture anyone, they're trying to burn down the house. The implication hit everyone in the secure room simultaneously. This wasn't a kidnapping attempt, or even a straightforward assassination. It was meant to look like an accident. A tragic fire that would eliminate all witnesses while destroying any evidence they might have gathered. All teams' new priority, Sarah barked into her radio. Prevent the detonation of any incendiary devices. We need to take these people alive if possible, but stopping the fire is paramount. Team leader, came another voice. This one strained with effort. We've got 2 down on the north side, but the remaining attackers have made it to the first floor. They're moving systematically through the house. Malik found himself gripping the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. Mr. Green, what happens if they find this room? They won't, Bernard replied, though his own tension was evident. The entrance is completely hidden, and the room is soundproofed. Even if they search the library, they'd have no reason to suspect this space exists. But even as he spoke, they could hear movement in the library above them. Footsteps, the sound of books being thrown to the floor, furniture being overturned. The attackers were conducting a systematic search, and they were getting closer. Sarah, Bernard whispered, do you have weapons in here? Sarah nodded grimly and moved to a concealed cabinet, retrieving 2 pistols and several magazines of ammunition. I hope we don't need these, but if they find us... The footsteps above them had stopped, replaced by a different sound. Something metallic being dragged across the floor. Then came a new voice, muffled by the ceiling, but still audible. Check behind the bookshelf. Guys like Green always have hidden rooms. The words sent ice through Malik's veins. These weren't random intruders, they knew exactly what they were looking for and had come prepared to find it. Someone had provided them with detailed intelligence about the house and its secrets. That's impossible, Bernard whispered. Only family members and my most trusted security personnel know about this room. Sarah's expression was grim as she checked her weapon. Sir, someone in your inner circle has betrayed you. The sound of books falling intensified above them, followed by what sounded like someone testing the wall behind the bookshelf. Bernard's face had gone ashen as he realized the implications. If the attackers knew about the secure room, they might also know about other safety measures, escape routes, and defensive positions. Team leader, Sarah's radio whispered urgently. We've lost contact with Team 3. Last known position was the library area. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, understanding what that meant. Her people were being systematically eliminated by professionals who had anticipated their defensive positions. The mission was going badly wrong, and they were running out of options. A new sound reached them from above, the unmistakable whine of a power drill being used on the bookshelf mechanism. Someone was attempting to force their way through the hidden entrance, and they had the tools to do it. "Mr. Green," Sarah said quietly, "there's an emergency exit from this room that leads to the wine cellar. From there, we can reach the tunnel that connects to the old carriage house. If we move now, we might be able to get you both out before they breach this room." "What about your team?" "My team's job is to protect you, sir. They'll buy us the time we need." As if to emphasize her point, the sound of gunfire erupted from somewhere directly above them, followed by shouts and the crash of heavy furniture. The battle for the house was reaching its climax, and the outcome was far from certain. "We need to go now," Sarah urged, moving toward what looked like a solid wall, but was apparently another hidden door. But as she reached for the concealed handle, a new sound froze them all in place, the mechanical click of the bookshelf entrance being unlocked from above. Someone had figured out how to bypass the security mechanism, and in seconds, armed intruders would be pouring into their supposedly safe refuge. "Too late," Sarah whispered, raising her weapon toward the entrance. "Get behind the equipment rack and stay down." The bookshelf swung open with a groan of hinges, revealing dark figures in tactical gear silhouetted against the library's emergency lighting. Red laser dots danced across the secure room's walls as the intruders swept the space with their weapons, searching for targets. "Well, well," said a familiar voice from behind the tactical masks. "Bernard Green and his little guardian angel. How touching." The lead figure stepped into the room, removing his night vision goggles, to reveal a face that Bernard recognized with shock and betrayal. It wasn't Victor Castellanos. It was James Morrison, his chief financial officer and one of his most trusted advisors for over 15 years. "James," Bernard's voice was filled with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" "Cleaning up a mess that should have been resolved 3 years ago," Morrison replied calmly. "You were always too stubborn for your own good, Bernard. When you started investigating the pharmaceutical acquisitions, we tried to discourage you through legitimate channels. When that didn't work, we decided more direct action was necessary." "We? Who else is involved?" Morrison smiled coldly. "Did you really think Victor was running this operation alone? The embezzlement was just the beginning. Bernard, we've been systematically acquiring assets from every company in your portfolio, building a shadow empire that you never even suspected existed." The revelation hit Bernard like a physical blow. His most trusted advisor had been betraying him for years, stealing not just money, but entire portions of his business empire. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. "The murder attempt," Bernard said slowly, pieces falling into place. "Marissa said Victor forced her to do it, but you were the one pulling the strings." "Victor was a useful idiot, nothing more. When the boy here interfered with our timeline, we had to improvise. Victor's about to have a very unfortunate accident during his flight to South America, a tragic mechanical failure that will eliminate him as a loose end." Malik listened to this exchange with growing horror, understanding that they'd uncovered something far larger and more dangerous than simple corporate theft. These people had been playing a long game systematically, destroying Bernard's empire from within, while making it look like legitimate business operations. "James," Sarah said quietly, her weapon still trained on the intruders, "you're outnumbered here. My team will have called for backup by now." Morrison laughed. "Your team is dead, Ms. Chen. All of them. We've been planning this operation for months, and we came prepared for your defensive measures." "That's impossible. I have 12 people on this property." "You had 12 people. Now you have 0 plus 3 civilians who are about to become very unfortunate casualties of a tragic house fire." As if on cue, they could smell smoke beginning to filter into the secure room. The incendiary devices had been activated, and the house was beginning to burn around them. The attackers had planned this as a complete elimination. No witnesses, no evidence, just a terrible accident that would close all investigations permanently. "You see," Morrison continued, "the beauty of this plan is its simplicity. Bernard Green, distraught over his wife's arrest and the investigation into his company, brought a homeless boy home out of guilt and gratitude. Tragically, electrical problems in this old house caused a fire that killed them both, along with his entire security team. Very sad, but these things happen. Except that we know the truth, Malik said, finding his voice despite his terror. We know about the embezzlement, about the conspiracy, about everything. You knew about it past tense. In about 10 minutes, when this house finishes burning down with all of you inside it, that knowledge dies with you. The smoke was getting thicker now, and they could hear the roar of flames spreading through the upper floors of the house. Morrison's plan was working perfectly. Even if authorities arrived soon, they'd assume the deaths were accidental casualties of the fire, not deliberate murders. But as Morrison raised his weapon to end the conversation permanently, a new sound cut through the chaos. The distant wail of sirens approaching at high speed. Lots of sirens getting closer every second. Morrison's confident expression flickered slightly. Local fire department. They'll be too late to save anyone and too concerned with fighting the fire to investigate suspicious circumstances. Those aren't fire trucks, Sarah said with the first smile she'd shown all evening. Those are federal agents. Mr. Green, it sounds like Detective Rodriguez called in some very serious backup. The approaching sirens were indeed different from typical emergency vehicles. Multiple engines coordinated arrival patterns, and what sounded like helicopter support in the distance. Morrison's face went pale as he realized his perfect plan might have a fatal flaw. Federal agents, one of his men asked nervously. Boss, you didn't say anything about feds being involved. Shut up and finish the job, Morrison snapped, but his own nervousness was beginning to show. We complete the mission, and then extract through the tunnel system. But Bernard was smiling now despite their desperate situation. James, there is no tunnel system. I told Sarah about an emergency exit, but it's actually just a closet. There's only one way out of this room, and you're standing in it. Morrison's confident facade cracked completely as he realized he'd been trapped by the same kind of deception he'd been practicing for years. The approaching sirens were getting louder, and smoke was beginning to fill the secure room despite its filtration system. Sir, one of Morrison's men said urgently, we need to extract now, or we're going to be caught in this fire ourselves. Morrison's calculation was swift and brutal. Kill them all. We'll make our escape through the main house and deal with the federal agents as they arrive. But as he raised his weapon, Sarah Chen proved why Bernard had hired her. With movement so fast it seemed almost supernatural, she dove sideways while firing 3 precise shots that dropped 2 of Morrison's men before they could react. Malik and Bernard hit the floor as gunfire erupted in the confined space muzzle flashes, strobing like deadly lightning. The battle for the secure room lasted less than 30 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When the smoke cleared, Morrison was wounded but alive. His remaining men were either dead or incapacitated, and Sarah was bleeding from a graze across her shoulder, but still standing. Federal agents! Voices shouted from the library above. Secure the area. Down here, Sarah called back. We have wounded and need immediate medical assistance. The cavalry had arrived just in time, but as they waited for rescue, Bernard looked at Malik with an expression of profound realization. This brave boy had not only saved his life, but had helped expose a conspiracy that reached to the very heart of his business empire. The embezzlement was just the beginning. Morrison and his associates had been systematically destroying everything Bernard had built, and they'd come very close to getting away with it completely. The fire sirens were getting closer now, racing to save what remained of the house, but more importantly, the truth had survived. Morrison's conspiracy was broken. The evidence was preserved, and for the first time in hours, they might actually be safe. As federal agents secured the scene and paramedics tended to the wounded, Bernard put his arm around Malik's shoulders and felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of knowing that justice was finally within reach. The smell of smoke still clung to their clothes as federal agents escorted Bernard and Malik through the charred remains of what had once been an elegant colonial mansion. Dawn was breaking over the Connecticut countryside, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed obscenely beautiful, given the night's violence. Paramedics had treated Sarah's shoulder wound and declared her fit for duty, though she moved with obvious discomfort as she coordinated with the FBI team leader, Agent Rebecca Torres. The lead federal investigator introduced herself, extending a firm handshake to Bernard. "I've been tracking financial irregularities in pharmaceutical companies for the past 2 years. What happened here tonight confirms our worst suspicions about the scope of this conspiracy." Bernard studied the woman's face, noting the intelligence in her dark eyes and the weariness that suggested she'd been working this case for longer than 2 years. "Agent Torres, exactly how much did you know about Morrison's operation?" "More than we could prove, less than we needed to prosecute. Your CFO has been very careful about covering his tracks using shell companies and offshore accounts to hide the movement of funds. Without direct evidence of the embezzlement or witness testimony connecting him to specific crimes, we've been building a circumstantial case that might not have held up in court. But now you have Morrison himself caught in the act of attempted murder." "Exactly. And more importantly, we have the financial records that his people were trying to destroy in the fire." Torres gestured toward a team of FBI technicians who were carefully extracting computer equipment and file cabinets from the house's relatively undamaged east wing. Morrison's mistake was thinking he could eliminate all the evidence in one dramatic gesture. Malik watched the federal agents work with fascination, still struggling to process how dramatically his life had changed in less than 24 hours. "Agent Torres, what happens to Mr. Morrison now?" "He's currently in federal custody receiving medical treatment for his gunshot wounds. Once he's stable, he'll be facing charges of attempted murder, arson, conspiracy, embezzlement, and about a dozen other federal crimes. If convicted on all counts, he's looking at life in prison without the possibility of parole." "What about the other people he mentioned, the shadow empire he claimed to be building?" Torres exchanged glances with her fellow agents, a look that suggested they'd been hoping someone would ask that question. "That's where things get complicated. Based on the financial records we've recovered so far, Morrison's operation extends far beyond green pharmaceuticals. We're looking at systematic theft from at least 12 major corporations across multiple industries." Bernard felt his stomach drop. 12 companies. How is that possible? Morrison and his associates have been placing operatives in key financial positions throughout corporate America. CFOs, head accountants, board members, people with access to large amounts of money and the authority to move it without immediate oversight. They've essentially been running a nationwide embezzlement network disguised as legitimate business operations. Jesus Christ! How much money are we talking about? Conservative estimate, $700 million over the past 5 years. But that's just what we can trace so far. The actual amount could be significantly higher. The number hit the group like a physical blow. This wasn't just corporate theft. It was economic warfare conducted by people who'd sworn to protect the very institutions they were systematically destroying. "Agent Torres," Sarah interrupted, wincing as she adjusted her wounded shoulder. "If this conspiracy is as widespread as you're suggesting, how do we know we can trust anyone? Morrison had inside information about this safe house, about our security protocols, about everything." "That's an excellent question, and frankly, it's one that's been keeping me awake at night." Torres pulled out a secure tablet and began scrolling through what appeared to be surveillance photos. "We've identified at least 23 individuals who we suspect are part of Morrison's network. They include executives at major corporations, government officials, and unfortunately, several people in law enforcement." "Law enforcement?" Bernard's voice was sharp with concern. "You mean like the people who were supposed to be protecting Marissa?" "The attack on your wife in police custody was definitely an inside job. We've arrested the officer who facilitated it, and he's been very cooperative in exchange for a reduced sentence. According to his statement, Morrison's people have been placing assets in police departments and prosecutors' offices for years." Malik felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "So they could have gotten to us anywhere. Police stations, courthouses, even FBI offices. Potentially, yes. Which is why we're conducting this investigation using only agents who've been thoroughly vetted and isolated from normal departmental communications. As far as most of the Bureau knows, this is still just a routine financial crimes investigation. As they spoke, a black SUV approached along the estate's damaged driveway, its government plates reflecting the early morning sunlight. The vehicle stopped near the command post that FBI technicians had established in the mansion's undamaged garage, and a tall man in an expensive suit emerged from the passenger seat. "Deputy Director Harrison," Torres said, her tone becoming noticeably more formal. "I wasn't expecting you on scene so early. When one of our most important financial crimes investigations turns into a military-style assault on civilians, Agent Torres, I tend to take a personal interest." Harrison's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "I trust you have the situation under control." "Yes, sir. We've secured the scene, arrested the primary suspect, and recovered significant evidence related to the broader conspiracy." Harrison's gaze swept across the group, lingering on Malik, with an expression that was difficult to read. "And this is the young man who started this whole investigation." "Malik Williams, sir," Bernard said, placing a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "If it weren't for his courage, we'd all be dead right now, and Morrison's conspiracy would have remained hidden indefinitely." "Remarkable," Harrison said, though something in his tone suggested he found the situation more concerning than remarkable. "Mr. Williams, I understand you've been through quite an ordeal. We've arranged for you to be debriefed by our child psychologists before you're released to social services." "Social services?" Bernard's voice was sharp with alarm. "Deputy Director, I've assumed responsibility for Malik's welfare. He's not going into the system." "I'm afraid that's not your decision to make, Mr. Green. The boy is a minor with no legal guardian, and he's been the target of multiple murder attempts. For his own safety, he needs to be placed in protective custody until this investigation is complete." Malik felt the familiar panic rising in his chest, the same feeling he'd experienced every time adults started making decisions about his life without consulting him. "Sir, I don't want to go into protective custody. I want to stay with Mr. Green." "I understand your feelings, son, but this is about keeping you safe. Morrison's network is larger than we initially thought, and until we've arrested all the conspirators, you'll be in danger anywhere that isn't under federal protection." "How long would that take?" Bernard asked. "Weeks, possibly months. This investigation is going to require extensive coordination with international law enforcement, financial institutions, and corporate security departments. It's not something that can be resolved quickly." Torres shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of undercurrents in the conversation that were making her uneasy. "Deputy Director, perhaps we could discuss alternative arrangements that would keep Mr. Williams safe while allowing him to remain with Mr. Green." "Agent Torres, are you questioning my assessment of the security situation?" "No, sir. I'm simply suggesting that we explore all available options before making permanent decisions about the boy's placement." Harrison's expression hardened slightly, and Malik noticed that several of the other FBI agents had stopped their work to listen to the conversation. Something about the deputy director's presence seemed to be making everyone nervous. "Agent Torres, I think you may be allowing emotional considerations to cloud your professional judgment. The boy goes into protective custody today, and that's final." "Actually," a new voice interrupted, "I think Agent Torres is absolutely right to question that decision." Everyone turned to see Detective Rodriguez approaching from the direction of the main road, accompanied by two men in suits who were obviously federal agents. His presence on what was supposed to be an FBI-only crime scene was clearly unexpected. "Detective Rodriguez," Harrison said coolly, "this is now a federal investigation. Your jurisdiction ended when we took over the case. Normally, you'd be right. But this morning, the Attorney General's office issued a special directive placing this investigation under joint federal-local oversight. Apparently, someone in Washington is very concerned about the possibility of federal agencies being compromised by Morrison's conspiracy. Harrison's face went pale, and Malik noticed that his hand moved instinctively toward his jacket pocket before stopping. "I wasn't informed of any such directive." "No, you weren't. Which is interesting considering that as deputy director, you should have been one of the first people notified." Rodriguez gestured to the two agents who'd accompanied him. "These gentlemen are from the Attorney General's Special Investigations Unit. They have some questions about your involvement in this case." The confrontation was electric with tension, as federal agents found themselves facing off against other federal agents, each group uncertain about who they could trust. Torres stepped back from Harrison, her hand moving subtly toward her weapon, while the other FBI agents on scene began choosing sides based on loyalties that were suddenly very unclear. "This is absurd," Harrison said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "I'm here because this investigation has national security implications that require oversight at the highest levels." "Then you won't mind answering some questions about your financial records," one of the Attorney General's agents said calmly. "Specifically about several offshore accounts that appear to be connected to shell companies controlled by James Morrison." The accusation hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Harrison's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, indignation, fear, and finally, resignation. He'd been caught, and everyone present knew it. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," Harrison said quietly. Morrison's operation wasn't just about stealing money. It was about restructuring the entire corporate landscape of this country, eliminating inefficiencies, and consolidating power in the hands of people who actually understand how to use it properly. "By murdering people?" Rodriguez asked incredulously. "By removing obstacles to progress?" Bernard Green's investigation would have exposed operations that are vital to national economic security. Sometimes individual sacrifices are necessary for the greater good. Bernard stared at the man who'd just casually discussed his murder as a necessary sacrifice for economic policy. "You're talking about treason. You and Morrison have been systematically destroying American businesses from within. We've been optimizing them, removing redundancies, consolidating resources, creating efficiencies that benefit everyone in the long run. Everyone except the people you've stolen from, and the employees who've lost their jobs and the shareholders who've been defrauded," Torres said angrily. "You've been running a criminal enterprise disguised as economic reform." As the Attorney General's agents moved to arrest Harrison, he made one last desperate play. "Agent Torres, you have no idea how deep this goes. Morrison and I are small fish in a much larger ocean. If you arrest me, you'll never find the people who are really running this operation." "Then I guess you'd better start talking," Rodriguez said grimly. But Harrison's expression had shifted to something approaching panic as he realized the implications of his situation. "You don't understand. The people at the top of this conspiracy don't leave loose ends. If they think I'm going to cooperate with law enforcement—" His words were cut off by the sharp crack of a sniper's rifle from somewhere in the surrounding forest. Harrison's body jerked once before collapsing to the ground, blood spreading across his expensive suit. Federal agents dove for cover as a second shot shattered the windshield of the SUV he'd arrived in. "Sniper!" Torres shouted, drawing her weapon and scanning the tree line. "Everyone get down!" Malik found himself pressed to the ground between Bernard and Sarah, all three of them using the damaged mansion's stone steps for cover. Around them, federal agents were shouting coordinates and calling for backup as they tried to locate the shooter's position. "Control, this is Torres. We have shots fired at the Connecticut location. One federal agent down, sniper still active. Request immediate tactical support." "Copy that, Agent Torres. Helicopter units are en route. ETA 12 minutes. "We might not have 12 minutes," Sarah muttered, scanning the forest with professional eyes. "That shooter is positioned to cover all the main approaches to this property. If there are more conspirators coming—" As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching vehicles could be heard from multiple directions. Not the organized arrival of law enforcement, but the chaotic roar of several cars converging on their position at high speed. How many people are involved in this conspiracy? Malik asked, his voice barely audible over the growing noise. Apparently, more than we thought, Bernard replied grimly. Rodriguez was coordinating with the other federal agents, establishing defensive positions using the mansion's ruins and the various vehicles on the property. Torres, we need to get Green and the boy out of here. This is turning into a war zone. Agreed, but how the sniper has overwatch on all the obvious escape routes, and we don't know how many hostiles are approaching. There, Sarah pointed toward the mansion's damaged east wing. The fire didn't reach the old servants' quarters. There might be a back entrance we can use to reach the woods on the south side of the property. It was a desperate plan, but with gunfire beginning to erupt from multiple directions as the approaching vehicles reached the estate's perimeter, desperation was their only option. Torres organized a covering team to lay down suppressive fire, while Sarah led Bernard and Malik toward what remained of the house's rear entrance. The servants' quarters had indeed survived the fire, though they reeked of smoke and were littered with debris from the collapsed upper floors. Sarah moved through the damaged rooms with military precision, checking corners and doorways for threats, while guiding them toward what she hoped would be a usable exit. There, she whispered, pointing to a door that led to what had once been a kitchen garden. If we can make it to the tree line, we might be able to work our way around to where Rodriguez's people set up their command post. But as they approached the door, Malik noticed something that made his blood freeze. Sarah looked at the ground outside. Boot prints in the mud led directly to the door. They were planning to use fresh prints that were still filling with rainwater from the previous night's storm. Someone had been here recently, and they were probably still close. Back up slowly, Sarah whispered, drawing her weapon. We're walking into an ambush. They'd barely begun to retreat when the door burst open, revealing 3 armed figures in tactical gear. Sarah managed to fire twice before diving sideways, her shots taking down 1 attacker, but leaving 2 more who immediately began spraying the room with automatic weapons fire. Bernard grabbed Malik and pulled him behind an overturned table as bullets splintered the wood around them. Sarah had taken cover behind a stone fireplace, but she was pinned down and outnumbered. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and their escape route had become a death trap. "Green!" one of the attackers shouted over the gunfire. "This doesn't have to end with everyone dying. Give us the boy, and we'll let you walk away." "Like hell!" Bernard shouted back, pulling Malik closer. "You people have already tried to kill us multiple times tonight." That was before we realized how valuable the kid might be. He's seen everything, heard everything. Our employers are willing to pay handsomely for him. The revelation was chilling. Malik wasn't just a witness to be eliminated, he was a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. Whatever information he possessed was apparently worth more than his life. "What do they want with me?" Malik whispered to Bernard. "I don't know, but we're not going to find out." Sarah had been listening to the exchange while calculating angles and ammunition counts. "Bernard," she called softly, "can you get to the cellar stairs? If you can make it down there, you might be able to reach the old root cellar and escape through the exterior doors. What about you? I'll buy you time. Go now while they're focused on negotiating." But before anyone could move, new gunfire erupted from outside. Not the scattered shots of a continuing battle, but the organized volleys of a coordinated assault. The attackers in the doorway began shouting into their radios, clearly receiving orders that were changing their priorities. "All units abort current operation, federal helicopters, inbound extract immediately." The tactical retreat was swift and professional, but it left the mansion's occupants in an eerily quiet aftermath. The gunfire outside had stopped as well, replaced by the growing sound of approaching helicopters that would finally bring overwhelming federal support to their desperate situation. "Torres to all units." The radio crackled from somewhere in the house. "Sound off. We need a status report on all personnel." Sarah helped Bernard and Malik to their feet, checking them both for injuries before responding to the call. "Chen here. I'm with Green and the boy in the servants' quarters. We're secure but shaken." "Copy that. Harrison is dead, killed by sniper fire. Unknown number of hostile vehicles fled the scene when air support approached. We're going to need extensive debriefs from everyone." As federal helicopters landed on what remained of the mansion's front lawn, Malik reflected on how completely his world had changed. 24 hours ago, he'd been invisible, just another homeless kid surviving on the streets. Now he was at the center of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and corporate America. But more than that, he'd found something he'd been searching for his entire life without even knowing it: a family. Bernard had risked everything to protect him, and Sarah had been willing to die defending them both. For the first time since his grandmother's death, Malik felt like he belonged somewhere. "Agent Torres," Bernard said, as the FBI team leader approached their position. "I want to make something very clear. Malik stays with me. No protective custody, no social services, no government facilities. He's part of my family now, and families protect each other." Torres looked at the unlikely pair, the billionaire pharmaceutical executive and the homeless boy who'd saved his life, and saw something that gave her hope. In a case filled with betrayal, corruption, and murder, here was proof that decency and courage still existed. "Mr. Green, given the extraordinary circumstances and Malik's role in exposing this conspiracy, I think we can work out an arrangement that keeps him safe while respecting his wishes. But you both need to understand that this investigation is far from over. Harrison's death proves that there are still people out there willing to kill to protect this conspiracy." "Then we'll face them together," Bernard said, putting his arm around Malik's shoulders. "All of us." As they walked toward the helicopters that would take them away from the smoking ruins of the safe house, none of them could have imagined the revelations still to come. Harrison's death had eliminated one key figure in the conspiracy, but it had also sent a message to the remaining conspirators. Anyone who might cooperate with law enforcement was now a target for elimination. The war between justice and corruption was far from over, and the stakes were about to get much higher. But for the first time since this ordeal began, Malik felt like he had people worth fighting for, and reasons to believe that good might actually triumph over evil. The helicopters lifted off into the morning sky, carrying them toward an uncertain future, but away from the immediate danger that had nearly claimed their lives. Behind them, the mansion continued to smolder, a monument to the violence that greed and corruption could unleash when challenged by simple human decency. The boy who had started this entire chain of events by shouting a warning through a restaurant window was no longer alone in the world. And that, perhaps, was the most important victory of all. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan stood like a fortress against the gray October sky, its neoclassical columns casting long shadows across the plaza, where media crews had been camped for 3 weeks. Inside the building's most secure courtroom, the trial that had captivated the nation was entering its final phase, and Malik Williams sat in the witness chair facing a jury that would determine the fate of one of the largest corporate conspiracies in American history. 6 months had passed since that violent night at the Connecticut safe house, 6 months during which federal investigators had unraveled a web of corruption that stretched across dozens of corporations and reached into the highest levels of government. The scope of the conspiracy had shocked even seasoned federal prosecutors: over $2 billion in stolen assets, 47 indicted conspirators, and a network of financial manipulation that had been operating for nearly a decade. "Mr. Williams," the federal prosecutor Angela Martinez said gently, "I know this has been difficult for you, but I need you to tell the jury one more time about what you witnessed on the evening of March 15th at the Park Cafe." Malik took a deep breath, glancing toward the gallery where Bernard sat in the front row, offering an encouraging nod. Beside Bernard sat Sarah Chen, her arm still in a sling from injuries sustained during a second assassination attempt just 3 weeks earlier. The courtroom was packed with reporters, federal agents, and family members of victims whose lives had been destroyed by the conspiracy. "I was watching from outside the restaurant window." Malik began, his voice steady despite the weight of attention focused on him. I saw Mrs. Green pour something from a small bottle into Mr. Green's soup while he was distracted by his phone. She looked nervous, like she was afraid of being caught. And what did you do when you realized what you'd witnessed? I tried to warn him. I knew I'd probably get in trouble for going into such an expensive restaurant, looking like I did, but I couldn't just watch someone get murdered. Martinez nodded, making eye contact with several jurors. Mr. Williams, at the time you made this decision to intervene, what did you know about Bernard Green? Nothing really. I knew he was rich because of his clothes and the restaurant he was in, but I didn't know his name or anything about his business. I just saw a human being in danger and tried to help. And what has happened to your life since that evening? Malik's expression brightened for the first time during his testimony. Mr. Green became my legal guardian. He's given me a home, enrolled me in private school, and made me part of his family. But more than that, he's shown me that there are good people in the world who are willing to fight for what's right no matter what it costs them. The defense attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Patricia Kellerman, rose for cross-examination with the predatory confidence of someone who'd built her career defending corporate criminals. She represented Victor Castellanos, who'd been extradited from South America after a joint operation by the FBI and Interpol. Mr. Williams, Kellerman began her tone suggesting that she found his entire testimony suspect. Isn't it true that you'd been living on the streets for several months before this alleged incident? Yes, ma'am. Since my grandmother died and I aged out of the foster care system. And during that time, you were presumably desperate for food shelter and financial security. I was hungry most of the time, yes. So, when you saw an opportunity to ingratiate yourself with a billionaire, you took it, didn't you? You made up this story about witnessing a poisoning attempt in order to position yourself as his savior. The accusation hung in the air like poison, and Malik felt his face flush with anger. That's not true. I saw what I saw, and I told the truth about it. But you've certainly benefited from your heroism, haven't you? Expensive private school, beautiful home, unlimited financial resources, quite an improvement over sleeping in doorways and eating from garbage cans. Objection? Martinez called sharply. Counsel is badgering the witness and implying facts not in evidence. Sustained, Judge Harrison ruled. Ms. Kellerman, confine your questions to matters directly relevant to the charges. But Kellerman wasn't finished. Mr. Williams, isn't it true that you've been coached extensively by federal prosecutors on what to say in this courtroom? I've told the truth from the beginning. Nobody has told me to lie about anything. Really? Then perhaps you can explain why your story has changed in several significant details since your initial statement to police. Malik felt a moment of panic as he tried to remember every conversation he'd had with law enforcement over the past 6 months. I don't understand. What details? In your initial statement, you said Mrs. Green looked around nervously before adding the substance to the soup. But in your FBI interview 3 weeks later, you said she checked to make sure no one was watching. Those are two different things, aren't they? No, they're the same thing. Looking around nervously and checking to make sure no one was watching, that's what she was doing. Are you certain? Because in your deposition last month you said she glanced around furtively. That's a very specific word for a child your age to use, isn't it? Almost as if someone had suggested it to you. Martinez was on her feet again. Objection, counsel is making arguments rather than asking questions. Sustained. Ms. Kellerman, ask questions or move on. Kellerman smiled coldly, sensing weakness. Mr. Williams, how much money has Bernard Green spent on you since you became his ward? I don't know. I don't keep track of things like that. Would it surprise you to learn that your private school tuition alone costs more than $60,000 per year? And that your clothing, housing, medical care, and other expenses total well over $200,000 annually? Objection, Martinez called. Relevance. I'm establishing the witness's financial motivation to maintain his story, Your Honor. I'll allow it, but get to the point quickly. Kellerman turned back to Malik with renewed confidence. Isn't it true that if your testimony is discredited, you'll lose everything? The nice house, the expensive school, the family that's taken you in, all of it depends on maintaining this fiction about witnessing a poisoning attempt. The question hit Malik like a physical blow, not because it was true, but because it forced him to confront fears he'd been trying to suppress for months. What if the jury didn't believe him? What if his testimony wasn't enough to convict the conspirators? What if Bernard decided he was more trouble than he was worth? But as these doubts swirled through his mind, Malik caught sight of Bernard in the gallery. The older man was leaning forward slightly, his expression intense but supportive. Not the look of someone protecting an investment, but the look of a father watching his son face a difficult challenge. "Ma'am," Malik said quietly, "if telling the truth means I lose everything, then that's what I'll have to live with. But I won't lie, not for money, not for security, and not to make anyone happy. I saw Mrs. Green try to poison her husband, and I'd tell that truth even if it meant going back to living on the streets." The conviction in his voice seemed to resonate through the courtroom. Several jurors nodded slightly, and even Judge Harrison looked impressed by the boy's integrity. Kellerman tried several more lines of attack, but Malik's testimony remained consistent and credible. When he finally stepped down from the witness stand, the prosecution's case had been significantly strengthened by his courage under pressure. "The prosecution calls Dr. Elizabeth Warren," Martinez announced. Dr. Warren was the toxicologist who'd analyzed the ricin found in Marissa's purse, and her testimony was devastating to the defense. The poison was military-grade, traceable to a specific batch that had been manufactured for biological weapons research. Even more damning financial records showed that Victor Castellanos had made several payments to the private military contractor who'd manufactured the ricin. Dr. Warren, Martinez continued, "In your expert opinion, would the amount of ricin found in Mrs. Green's possession have been sufficient to kill her husband?" "Absolutely. The concentration was extremely high. A dose of that size would have caused massive organ failure within 6 to 8 hours. Death would have been virtually certain, and the symptoms would have been consistent with a heart attack or stroke, making detection unlikely without specific toxicological testing. And would there have been any way to treat or counteract the poisoning once the ricin had been consumed?" "None whatsoever. Once ingested ricin is essentially 100% fatal at the dosage levels we detected." The clinical details of how close Bernard had come to death seemed to affect the jury deeply. Several members were taking extensive notes, and their expressions suggested growing anger at the conspiracy that had nearly succeeded in committing the perfect murder. But as Dr. Warren's testimony concluded, Martinez received an urgent note from one of her assistants. She read it quickly, her expression shifting to one of alarm, then requested a brief recess to confer with her team. "Your Honor," Martinez said when court reconvened, "the prosecution has just received information that may significantly impact this case. We've been informed that another attempt was made on Mr. Green's life less than 2 hours ago." The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs as security officers immediately moved to escort Bernard and Malik to a secure location. Judge Harrison gavelled for order, his face grim with the implications of what he'd just heard. "Ms. Martinez, are you saying that the conspiracy is still actively targeting witnesses in this trial?" "That appears to be the case, Your Honor. Mr. Green was leaving his office building when a sniper opened fire from a nearby parking garage. He survived only because his security team had been anticipating such an attack." Kellerman was on her feet immediately. "Your Honor, I object to this entire line of discussion. Whatever may have happened to Mr. Green today has no bearing on the charges against my client, who has been in federal custody for the past 4 months. On the contrary," Martinez replied, "it demonstrates that this conspiracy is still active, and that the defendant's associates are willing to commit murder to prevent the truth from coming out." Judge Harrison considered the situation carefully. "Ms. Martinez, do you have evidence linking today's attack to the defendants currently on trial?" "We're investigating that possibility, Your Honor, But what's clear is that someone doesn't want this trial to continue, and they're willing to kill to stop it. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom and beyond. Within hours, news networks were reporting that the trial of the century had become even more dramatic, with attempts to assassinate key witnesses, even as the jury deliberated their fates. But the most shocking development came the following morning, when federal agents arrested Senator Robert Hastings as he attempted to board a private jet at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. Hastings, who chaired the Senate Banking Committee and had oversight authority over many of the regulatory agencies investigating the conspiracy, was found carrying classified documents and $2 million in untraceable bearer bonds. "Your Honor," Martinez announced as court reconvened, "the prosecution moves to introduce evidence that Senator Hastings has been coordinating with the defendants to obstruct this investigation and eliminate witnesses." The new evidence was devastating. Encrypted communications between Hastings and Morrison showed that the senator had been providing inside information about federal investigations for over 3 years. Even worse, financial records revealed that Hastings had received over $15 million in payments from the conspiracy's offshore accounts. "Ms. Martinez," Judge Harrison said gravely, "are you alleging that a sitting United States senator has been part of this conspiracy?" "That's exactly what we're alleging, Your Honor, and we have documentary evidence that Senator Hastings was planning to flee the country today with classified information that could have compromised ongoing investigations in multiple countries." Victor Castellanos, who'd maintained his innocence throughout the trial, finally cracked under the weight of evidence. His attorney requested an emergency meeting with prosecutors, and within hours he was offering to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. "Mr. Castellanos," Martinez said during his proffer session, "tell us about Senator Hastings' role in this conspiracy." "Hastings was our insurance policy," Castellanos said, his voice hollow with defeat. "Whenever law enforcement got too close to discovering our operations, he'd tip us off through encrypted channels. He also helped us identify which prosecutors and agents were most dangerous to our interests." "How long had he been working with your organization?" "Since the beginning. We recruited him when he was still a junior congressman desperate for campaign funding. We started with small payments for minor favors, then gradually increased his involvement until he was completely compromised." "What about the attempts on Mr. Green's life? Did Senator Hastings coordinate those?" "Hastings provided intelligence about Green's security arrangements and travel schedules. He also helped us identify which safe houses were being used by federal witness protection programs." The scope of the corruption was staggering. A United States senator had been actively working to murder witnesses in a federal trial using classified information and government resources to facilitate assassination attempts. But the revelations weren't finished. Castellanos also provided information about a planned attack on the courthouse itself, scheduled for the day of closing arguments. The plan involved a massive car bomb that would have killed not only the defendants and witnesses, but also the judge, jury, prosecutors, and hundreds of innocent people in the surrounding area. "Your Honor," Martinez said urgently, "we need to evacuate this building immediately. According to Mr. Castellanos, there may already be explosive devices in place." The evacuation was swift and thorough, with bomb-sniffing dogs and federal agents sweeping every inch of the courthouse. They found 3 separate explosive devices, one in the parking garage, one in the basement, and one hidden in a maintenance closet near the courtroom itself. "These weren't amateur devices," the bomb squad leader reported to Judge Harrison, as they reconvened in a secure federal facility across town. "Military-grade explosives, sophisticated timing mechanisms, and enough destructive power to level half the building. If they detonated during closing arguments, we'd be looking at hundreds of casualties." The discovery of the bombs had a profound impact on the jury. When deliberations finally began, it took them less than 4 hours to return guilty verdicts on all charges against all defendants. Victor Castellanos received life in prison without possibility of parole. James Morrison, who'd been convicted in absentia after dying from his injuries, was posthumously sentenced to life imprisonment. Senator Hastings, facing a separate trial for treason and conspiracy, would eventually receive the death penalty. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when Marissa Green, who'd ultimately testified against her co-conspirators, received a sentence of 25 years in federal prison. As she was led away in shackles, she looked directly at Malik with an expression of pure hatred. "You should have minded your own business, you little street rat," she hissed. "You have no idea what you've destroyed." "I destroyed nothing," Malik replied calmly. "I just told the truth about what I saw." 6 months later, Bernard and Malik stood together on the deck of Bernard's yacht, watching the sunset paint the Caribbean sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. The legal proceedings were finally over. The conspirators were behind bars, and they could begin to rebuild their lives without the constant threat of assassination hanging over them. "Malik," Bernard said, putting his arm around the boy's shoulders, "I've been thinking about something. You saved my life that night in the restaurant, but I think maybe you saved your own life too." "What do you mean?" "I mean that before that night we were both lost in different ways. I was so focused on building wealth that I'd forgotten what really mattered. And you were surviving on the streets with no family, no future, no hope. But when you chose to help a stranger, everything changed for both of us." Malik nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd just walked away that night, if I'd been too scared to get involved." "But you didn't walk away. Even though you had nothing to gain and everything to lose, you chose to do the right thing. That's not just courage, Malik, that's character. And character is something that can't be bought or sold or stolen." As they watched the sun disappear below the horizon, both of them reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. A homeless boy and a billionaire, brought together by a moment of crisis, had become a real family through shared trials and mutual respect. The conspiracy that had nearly destroyed them was finished, its leaders in prison or dead, its network of corruption exposed and dismantled. But more importantly, they'd learned something about the power of ordinary people to stand up against overwhelming odds when they choose to fight for what's right. "Bernard," Malik said quietly, "thank you. Not just for taking me in, but for believing in me when nobody else would. Thank you for reminding me that the most important things in life can't be measured in dollars or stock prices. You gave me back my soul, Malik. That's worth more than all the money in the world." As darkness fell over the Caribbean, they went below deck to join Sarah and the small group of friends who'd become their chosen family. Tomorrow, they would return to New York, where Bernard would begin the process of rebuilding his pharmaceutical empire with new ethical guidelines and complete transparency. Malik would continue his education, preparing for a future that held unlimited possibilities. But tonight, they would simply enjoy being together, a family forged not by blood or law, but by shared courage and the unshakable bond that forms when people risk everything to save each other. The boy who'd once survived by watching wealthy people eat through restaurant windows was now sitting at their table not as an outsider looking in, but as a beloved son who'd found his way home through an act of heroism that had changed everything for everyone involved. Sometimes, the smallest acts of courage can reshape the world in ways no one could have imagined. And sometimes when you save someone else's life, you discover that you've saved your own as well.